Yeah, I watched our last one just last night. Just watched it all the way through. That's kind of my prep for this. That's all I've done. So
You're starting.
Are we mic'd? We're ready to go?
Mm-hmm.
Volume levels are okay?
Okay. So you're going to start, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to start into one
Sure.
shot?
Yeah.
And then we'll just pop out to it too, and I'll do.
Sure.
Let me ask just up front, when this is all done, he's going to want to edit it, or is he going to work with a student on campus to edit it? Where's the footage going?
What you're getting is a switched copy, so everything that I'm doing back there will be kind of your edits.
Mhm.
So, for example, we'll start on like a 2-shot, and then as you're talking, we'll flick to you. Then as he goes to answer, we'll flick to him. So it'll already be mostly edited.
Okay.
Any fine editing, I'll arrange with someone afterward. But I guess you send me away today with something.
Right. Yeah.
A DVD, video. Listen, you don't have a copy of the book or any prototype of the graphics?
I just have a cover that they gave me a digital file of, but no, not till, it's not coming off the press till July.
Okay. Do you know what color it'll be? I mean, we could have made a fake one.
That's okay. You can just talk about how it's being released in July of 2014. So.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Thank you.
Are we ready, or we're just start?
Good to go.
Okay.
Give me about 15 seconds to get back there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
John M. Rector is a counseling psychologist in Southeast Idaho, where he provides psychotherapy to university students, writes and teaches on the psychology of religion. Dr. Rector is the past chairperson for the American Psychological Association Annual Convention for Division 36, Psychology of Religion. He is currently serving as assistant editor for the journal Issues in Religion and Psychotherapy. In July of 2014, Oxford University Press is releasing his first book, The Objectification Spectrum, Understanding and Transcending Our Diminishment and Dehumanization of Others. He and his wife Kirsten have 3 sons. John, can I call you John, Dr. Rector?
Please do,
Okay.
Dave. Yeah, I'll call you Dave.
A question first off, after reviewing your book, I was curious as to why you chose to write on this topic. What do you want to accomplish by publishing this type of book?
Well, that's a good introductory question, and I suppose it really grew out of the last 20 years of my study and research, focusing on the extremity of human behavior on both sides of this spectrum. On one hand, human beings are capable of remarkable depravity and destruction. And yet, on the other hand, human beings are capable of remarkable enlightenment, connection, empathy, compassion. And, how to make sense of this broad gulf of behavior that looks so different. As I thought about the problem of human evil, and I guess that's really what the book is addressing, is this classic problem, it seemed evident to me that what I was really clarifying for myself was that human beings have difficulty genuinely appreciating the depth and significance of other beings. And all incidences of evil that our kind perpetrate on each other and on the world at large, it seemed to me really comes from this place of misapprehending the reality of the subjectivity or the depth of the other. And so objectification just seemed to be the correct concept to address this problem of not really apprehending the depth that is present in the other.
So it sounds like central to your position is the case of the ego.
Yes.
Fundamental. It's our own. Is it our own vanity, our own self-absorption that creates a veil between ourselves and the other,
Well,
curious how that
I
would
think
play
that's
out.
part of it, Dave. As I thought about this, it occurred to me that there were a variety of built-in mechanisms, not to mention mechanisms that come from situations that come
Societal.
from without. Yes, we'll probably get to that later. But there are a number of aspects of our nature that just inherently sets us up to be objectifiers, one of which you've already referred to, and that is the ego. Which is, I guess, just the Latin term for I. It's the sense of self that we are most readily connected to or aware of. It's actually quite a superficial self that according to the great sages and mystics, most human beings think that's who they really are, is their ego. So the ego is part of the problem because it's not a true self, it's actually a false self. But there are other problems too. There's our inherent narcissism, which comes from our drive to survive and perpetuate the self. Our narcissism really is represented in what you said, our, how did you put it? You said our adoration of ourselves, or being very smitten with ourselves. That's our basic narcissism. But more than this, even the fact that human beings die and that we are aware of our mortality, our impending mortality, creates a number of problems for us psychologically on many levels. And this too plays a role in our tendencies to objectify others. That may sound far afield from our conversation at this point, but the reality of death plays a central role in human beings' objectification of one another and the evil that we perpetuate. The fact that we use language, which is such a boon in many ways to humankind, paradoxically also serves as a distancer from our own experience. Once we label something, we tend to have the perception that we have understood it in its totality, which of course we haven't. We've just understood surfaces that are easily named. So these and many other variables, Dave, I think play a substantial role in our tendency to do harm and objectify others.
Throughout your book, you refer to Plato's metaphor of the cave. This is kind of a leitmotif throughout the piece.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate? What do you mean? Explain to our viewers what the metaphor of the cave means in regard to objectification.
Okay. As I was attempting to create an organizing principle for this manuscript, it was my dear wife that said, you need some kind of an image or a metaphor to unify these thoughts. And as I thought about it, it occurred to me that Plato's metaphor of the cave was probably about as appropriate an image as there could be. And without going into a whole lot of depth, because it is a little complex, the metaphor is a complex one, and it is philosophy's best known metaphor, I think. Plato basically asserted that the human predicament is as if we are each prisoners in a cave deep underground, chained to the ground, arms and legs fettered down, restrainers placed on our heads so that we can't really turn to the right or to the left or look up or look down, but we're looking straight ahead and there's really no option. And then somewhere behind us, and this is a bit of a complex metaphor, so stay with me here, there's a fire burning in the cave that casts light onto the cave wall in front of us. And between ourselves and the fire is a path on which people walk carrying objects above their head made of stone, plaster, wood, etc., of animals, of geometric figures, of human statues, those
Recognizable
kinds of things.
things.
Recognizable things. But here's the catch: is there's a wall that acts as a screen, so that when we see the shadow on the cave wall as prisoners, we don't actually see the human beings carrying these things above their heads. All we see are the objects that they are carrying. And because that's all that we've been exposed to, for the entirety of our existence, we assume that those shadows represent the reality of existence, and that we understand reality only to the depth of a shadow, which of course is a completely superficial image. And this was Plato's assertion that all human beings are in this predicament. That is the depth of our perception of reality. It's very superficial and very shallow. And it's the calling of the philosopher to actually help not only enlighten themselves, but to enlighten the rest of humanity about our situation. So when I thought about the problem of objectification, I thought Plato's cave and the problem of taking shadows to be the genuine article was really an appropriate fit.
Plato's metaphor, the cave, can be, it's construed in so many different ways and can be applied to so many different fields of thought and concepts of reality. Do you suppose that it can be taken maybe one step further in that we, people, fettered in a cave, look and become comfortable with the objects going by to such a degree of regularity that we begin to feel comfortable predicting what will occur, and therefore further limiting, really. We're actually enchaining our own mental possibilities, our own understanding of what could be, because we're so used to what has been, that we start predicting. And when things become beyond, when things get out of that predictive mode, we become very uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's true. Human beings do not like unpredictability. We don't like ambiguity. We really prefer black and white existence. That helps diminish our anxiety. We're inherently an anxious species. And I think that's largely because of the incredibly complex brain that we have that can contemplate the future and realizes the inevitability of our own demise. And so we like predictability. We like stereotypes. They're a handy way of trying to make sense of a very complex world. And in some ways it can be helpful, but as of course you're very well aware, it can also cause a lot of problems when we assume facts about other beings that have incredible depth and complexity that we're unaware of and don't appreciate. So we begin treating all people of a certain group the same way, or making assumptions, and this of course plays a role in our tendencies to objectify others.
And therefore the need for your continuum. There is a gradation of objectification that you flesh out in the book, very persuasively, I might add. Could you elaborate on that? There are various degrees of objectification where we start in one level and can theoretically digress into the most horrific.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. As I thought about this concept, it became very clear to me that we were not talking about a discrete variable. It's not off or on, it's not all or nothing. We're really talking about a spectrum, and indeed, most of reality exists on a spectrum. So it shouldn't be a surprise that objectification is like that also. And for purposes of simplification, I divided it into 3 parts. So at the low end of the objectification spectrum, we have what I call casual indifference. And this is kind of the every person's objectification. This is kind of objectification that we carry around with us every day. And that is where we really are challenged to appreciate very greatly the complexity of others' inner experience. We may do a better job with our spouse or with our children, with our biological relatives, but the further away we get genetically, it seems, or geographically even, the more casually indifferent we seem to be. I gave an example in the book in a short footnote of this. As I was writing this very section of the book, I got an email that was notifying people in my department that the woman whose place I took when I took this position that I'm currently in, she was recently diagnosed with inoperable cancer and wasn't expected to live through the weekend. Now I felt a twinge of compassion for her and concern for her, but in truth that lasted seconds before I was again immersed in the process of my project at hand, as ironic as that is. But that's an example of casual indifference. I think we come by that honestly as human beings. That doesn't imply any guile on our part. It's just the reality of having an ego and being narcissistic and having a boundaried sense of self.
And our sense of priorities comes from the self and then goes outward.
Yes. Our inherent narcissism tells us that, hey, I am not, and you know, you would be the same. I am number one, and everybody else we know who's number 2 and 3 and 4. So that's casual indifference. And then in the middle of the spectrum is a term that I borrowed from the feminist philosopher Anne J. Cahill, and it's really a mouthful, but I couldn't think of a better term. It's called derivativization. So in other words, other people are seen as being mere derivatives of our own fears, wishes, hopes, and other feelings. Other aspects of their subjectivity are really disregarded and are seen as being unimportant. And derivativization itself represents kind of a subspectrum in the middle of this objectification spectrum. And you know, it has mild varieties and it also has extreme varieties. And one example of the mild variety, I refer to I guess what was a popular, was it Miller Lite or Budweiser? Less filling, tastes great, can't remember, but they ran a campaign ad back in the early 2000s with 2 attractive women who were getting into an argument on a veranda about whether the beer was less filling or tasted great. And of course the women went from an argument into a cat fight where clothing was being shed and they were falling into ponds and mud pits, and then it cut away to 2 young men at a bar who were thinking about, boy, what a wonderful commercial that would make. And then 2 women are somehow privy to this and are just disgusted looking at this. But so that would be a mild example of derivativization. And then at the high end of derivativization, I think we can safely say that the occurrences at Abu Ghraib prison that occurred in the mid-2000s, where U.S. military personnel just horrendously mistreated Iraqi detainees, and it ended in some of their deaths, actually, would be a good yes.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, please.
Your mic is rubbing somewhere.
Is it?
Let me get you a different one.
Okay.
Because it started very, very quietly, and I was like, maybe we can deal with it. And then it got worse.
As rubbing as in chafing, or is there a short in the...
I'm not sure.
Is it scratchy, scrackly, or muted?
Well,
Can you tell us where we left off so we can start back up? We were on a roll there.
I was on the derivativization.
If you just go back to your right, to the question that you were on.
They're different every time.
I'm just going to start with the extreme derivativization. We'll go to Abu Ghraib.
Okay.
Start there. Take a photo. I should have known.
I'm gonna-
Standing there.
Sick.
Otherwise, we're doing okay.
Oh, yeah. I was really quite upset that I couldn't hear. Can we get doing these things and get listening to the stories?
Okay. Do you want to do a test, or should we just assume this guy's going to be okay?
Let's do a test real quick.
Okay.
So I'll have to come back in again.
Okay. Blah, 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 blah. Testing, 1, 2. Chafing, rubbing,
Yeah.
making red. Yeah, I think it's going
My
well.
whole objective is
It's
just to
going
get you
well
to
so
talk
far.
about the
No,
book.
no,
So
you're doing
this is
fine.
not in line with what I have planned. My questions are derivatives of other questions that I've
No,
written.
it's good.
We're
Are we
okay?
good? Okay. So should I just start with the middle, with
We got through
Abu
Miller
Ghraib?
Lite, and
Yeah.
now
Yes.
on the extreme end of the derivativization.
Derivativization scale, yeah. Okay, door shut. And then in the more extreme manifestations, derivativization, I think, is well typified by what happened in the mid-2000s at the Abu Ghraib prison complex during the Iraq War, where United States military personnel, male and female, participated in rather horrendous abuses of Iraqi detainees. Without going into a lot of detail, there were actually some deaths that resulted of the severity of the abuse, and inquiries into that situation later revealed that the facilities were just in horrible shape, and the American employees, the military personnel there, were really going through some difficult psychological times for a variety of reasons. Long story short is these detainees really became derivatives of the military personnel's hostility, their anger, their resentment, their sadness over their lost comrades, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So bottom line is these Iraqi detainees really became mere derivatives of the extreme emotions of the U.S. military personnel. So that's the middle of the objectification spectrum. And then at the high end, we have dehumanization, which is objectification in such an extreme case that one does not see the other person as being even a human being anymore. So they're not only less than human, but they are non-human. And some classic examples from history of dehumanization, of course, would have to, of course, come out of Nazi Germany, the way that they treated the Jews and Slavs and other groups. And then more recently, between the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, the horrific violence that was engaged in there, we know that there was a substantial campaign of propaganda meant to inflame the passions and dehumanize the other side in order to grease the skids to such atrocities taking place. So here we have kind of this grand spectrum of objectification. Casual indifference doesn't look anything like dehumanization. I acknowledge this, but what I assert in the book is that the basic psychological mechanism is the same. It is the misapprehending of what others are in their totality. Simply the behavior and the severity of the abuse gets worse as we go along the spectrum. But it's the same psychology, is what I allege.
It seems to me, and having read the book, that there's an irony in our tendency to objectify others, largely due to our own laziness and our own ego. We're not willing to invest the emotional requirements to actually distinguish this person from that sort of person as an independent and fully human being. And the irony there, I suppose, is that the more we objectify others, the less humane and human we become. You quote in a couple of instances, Primo Levi, and there are ample Holocaust survivors who have remarked on this, that the guards themselves, who were in the process of dehumanizing these prisoners, in the process lost their humanity. I find that very ironic.
It is an irony, and perhaps one of the greatest paradoxes of all, Dave, is that the great sages and mystics throughout time have basically all said the same thing, and that is at the deepest levels of perception that human beings are capable of experiencing, there really is no separation and distance or difference between self and other. Now that may seem like crazy talk at the moment, because of course I'm over here and in this skin, and you're over there in that skin, and at this level of analysis that's very true. But apparently there are ways of perceiving that typify enlightenment, where those distinctions and differences vanish away and one cannot help but see self in other. So the irony is, the more we are entrenched in our own individual egos, the less we are really able to connect and see ourselves in others. So, there's really kind of paradox at multiple levels here.
Yeah. So that said, with this kind of paradoxical and reciprocal relationship that we all share, consciously or not, I wonder, and you don't really talk about this much in the book, but I'm just curious of your opinion on this. Is this an evolutionary necessity of our, is this a coping mechanism that has come across in our consciousness to allow us to compartmentalize and stereotype for matters of convenience? Because otherwise it would be so overwhelming that we couldn't cope.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation, and I think our capacities for objectification are there for a good reason, and in my opinion that results from the development of self-consciousness. Once our human brain developed to the extent that we had awareness of self, then we had the concerned self, which leads to a host of other psychological mechanisms that makes objectification possible. But let me back up just a little bit further.
And the awareness of self, by definition, creates the awareness of not self.
Yes,
and
yes,
therefore,
exactly.
your skin versus my skin.
Exactly, and whose skin is most important?
Mine is.
Yeah, but let me back up even further, and that is to acknowledge the obvious, and that is, look, human beings are finite quantities and entities. We have a finite amount of emotional energy to expend. And from an evolutionary perspective, the most important thing is to survive long enough to replicate, to perpetuate the species. And so I am going to be best served reserving my best emotional stuff, my greatest efforts and energy for my own biological relatives and my offspring.
Family, clan, tribe, society.
Tribe, exactly. I mean, and you know, the preciousness of each of those groups lessens as we go away from ourselves. So I suppose in some ways this has served our species well in the past. The problem, and I'm assuming we'll get to this at some point toward the end of the interview, is that in this vastly interconnected world that has been transformed by technology, we are no longer hunting and gathering by and large as human beings. This tendency to objectify has the capacity to obliterate the planet. So it's becoming in our best interest to actually transcend these tendencies. And indeed, I agree with some other thinkers who allege that we are slowly, yes, but inexorably heading in the direction of gradually greater enlightenment and more awareness of our tendencies to objectify, and therefore we can take steps to diminish this tendency in ourselves.
What are some contributors to that process, in your opinion? The gradual decline of objectification and dehumanization. We can still do it on a colossal scale.
Oh yes, and all you have to do is turn on the
And we always say
news.
never again, and
Right.
up it crops.
Next
But
thing you
perhaps
know.
in fewer and fewer increments, we hope.
Yeah, notice, Dave, that we're not going out in mass as a community anymore and watching someone being drawn and quartered or being broken on the wheel as entertainment, as my ancestors in Germany did just hundreds of years ago, as my ancestors in Britain did just hundreds of years ago. You know, we are no longer doing this.
So you attribute that to the Enlightenment?
Well, I would say that's a part, one part, an important part. In truth, you know, recently I would refer the interested person to Steven Pinker's fine text, "The Better Angels of Our Nature." I think he borrowed that title from Lincoln's second inaugural. But Pinker argues that that human violence is really, at this point, at its lowest levels in our history, and that's a shock to a lot of people, because mass media helps us see what's going on around the world in a very stark and real way, and yet it is all around the world, and so we would expect to see a fair amount of violence. But the truth is, in terms of our own society, for example, in the West, we are probably at our least violent time in history. And Pinker argues, you know, a number of factors play a role in that, and he has a mountain of statistics to back up his his arguments. Really quite fascinating. And I was certainly fascinated to run onto his work as I was working on this project.
Very good.
Yeah.
How can we better recognize the humanity in others? You spend probably the longest chapter of the book deals with the world's great religions and their heritage and their foundations. Have they been instrumental in this process of objectifying others, or have they been instrumental in the reverse of that, and that is, I suppose, being aware of of all of our equal humanity?
Well, my response to that question, Dave, would be to say yes. The world's great religions, I consider them to be the repositories of the collected wisdom of the human species. And yet, ironically, paradoxically, some of the world's greatest evil, some of the world's greatest pain and suffering that's been intentionally inflicted has been done so in the name of religion, has been done in the name of religion. And so this is indeed a great contradiction or paradox. And I think the way that I tend to make sense of that is the great mystics that founded each of the world's great religions really had mystical experience. Peak experience is what Maslow called it. Unity consciousness is what the great American philosopher Ken Wilber calls it. But they had an experience of mystical union with the infinite to the extent that they were able to see that we are all connected, that we are all one manifestation of the same reality of life. And they did their very best to dispense this message to their fellow human beings. The problem is most human beings are not peakers. They don't have peak experiences necessarily. It's not that we don't have the capacity for such, but most people are just not that way. And again, we like black and white. We don't like ambiguity. We want clarity. We want specific answers. And so I think it's really been in the hands of the great mystics' followers that some of the great evil that the world has seen in the name of religion has been done. And that is true whether we're speaking of Christianity or Islam or some of the other faiths, although it's hard for me to think of too many horrendous Buddhists right off.
Well, self-immolation in China is all the rage in protesting some of the Chinese government's involvement in Tibet.
That's more of an internalized thing to make a statement rather than going out and conquering, but I'm sure that there are some historians out there that would clarify that about Buddhism, but anyway, that's the main point I want to make there.
In your research for this book, did you notice whether the saturation of telecommunications in our society today, especially in the last 20 years or so, has it impacted our tendencies towards objectification? How has Facebook or Twitter or the internet impacted or had an effect on this process?
Well, I mean, it's almost with every question you ask, I say it's both. And here again, I want to say that. I want to say that it's actually, I think it's done both. It's made us aware of far-flung, distant others in a way that we never could have been before. You know this in terms of your nonprofit work, trying to raise awareness of these young African boys and girls who need sponsors, who need help, and you can communicate that message in a way that's powerful and effective using mass media, and yet the same mass media keeps us in our apartments, in our homes. We aren't interacting sometimes as much. Or
does it is it a form of insulation?
I think it is. I think it can be. It doesn't have to be, but I certainly think it can be. Not to mention the way that mass media is used to further objectify human beings. I mean, all you have to do is look at the multi-billion-dollar pornography industry in the United States and Western Europe and elsewhere. Apparently the Middle East is one of the largest consumers of Western pornography. So, you know, our technology really cuts both ways. It can unite us in ways that are remarkable in human history, and it can also keep us separate and distinct and distant.
One final question, and it has to do with a little bit of the technology that we discussed, and also some of the other aspects of this continuum of which and about which you write. Is modern society, are we becoming desensitized to the suffering of others in an age of decreasing violence? Do you think that media plays a role in furthering our appetite for violence? And is that a process or an attribute of objectification?
I would say that it is, and I don't think anyone can argue that the media is not becoming more and more saturated with violence and sexuality. Though I have to acknowledge a bias of my own, and that is, you know, there are many contexts in which sexuality is a totally healthy and wonderful thing between human beings. But it's hard to think of many contexts in which violence is a praiseworthy, admirable sort of thing. Yes, but there's certainly no question that violent portrayals are getting more extreme, and this probably has a desensitizing effect. This is where I think it becomes quite important to educate about the effects of mass media violence and sexuality, and how it can, in some ways, deaden our sensitivities to the realities of other people. But I'm certainly no advocate of censorship or those kinds of things. I think we have to take the good with the bad, and hopefully education is our greatest ally, and indeed is one of the factors that, you know, enlightenment is a long, painstaking process that I write about in the end of the book, and I don't think that there's any question that education has to play a substantial role in the enlightenment process. Maybe not formalized, but it's certainly been important in my life. I don't know where I'd be without it, of course, but.
You allude to it several times in your book throughout the chapters, and then near the end, as you mentioned, you offer the logical outcome of this continuum, this spectrum of objectification. On the other end of it is a spectrum of enlightenment. We look forward to the sequel, which undoubtedly will be along those lines, I hope.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the enlightenment.
The enlightenment spectrum.
Yeah.
Well, you know, so much of the book is focused on what's wrong with human nature, and also situations. I don't want to give situations short shrift. There's no question that certain kinds of toxic situations can bring out the very worst in human beings, even very good, otherwise very good, moral human beings. I think Stanley Milgram's research showed that very well. Philip Zimbardo's research showed that very well. Albert Bandura's research showed that very well.
For our viewers, we
Yes.
don't. They're not aware. They may not be aware that these are all social experiments.
Yes.
Milgram, Zimbardo.
Yeah,
These
classic.
they put them in artificial environments of high stress and following orders, be it a replicated prison system or
Yes.
a scientific experiment to elicit what turned out to be torture. Or purported torture. And so as we move into this enlightenment spectrum, elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, as I was saying, you know, I focused so much of the book on the problems with human nature. I felt like we needed some kind of positivity toward the end, and it occurred to me that that there is an opposite to the objectification spectrum. I guess what in psychological parlance you would call the opponent process, which is really just the mirror opposite of the objectification spectrum, which would be the enlightenment spectrum. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, my fascination with this came out of a study of the extremity of human behavior. So we can do incredibly depraved things, but we're capable of remarkable compassion and enlightenment. If we think of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and, you know, the Mother Teresas of the world, the Nelson Mandelas, et cetera, et cetera. So as I thought about it, I thought that, enlightenment must be a stage process, must be a continuum as well. It's not a discrete variable either. I've experienced this in my own life, though I make absolutely no claims to enlightenment. I think I'm at a little bit better place than I was when I was 17. But yes, so I divide the enlightenment spectrum up into 3 again. So low-level enlightenment I call casual concern, which is the opposite of casual indifference.
Okay.
And this is where you have just a general sense of goodwill toward the world at large and people in general. And without going into too much detail here, because I know we're running short on time, the middle section I call the interconnectedness. And this is where some of the realizations that people have in casual concern really come into sharper focus and actually lead to action. Beneficent action on the behalf of others, connecting others, helping others have access to opportunity, like you're doing with Enough to Spare.
So doing for others what they couldn't do themselves.
Sure, but just because of the sense of compassion that you have, a desire, kind of an ongoing desire to reach out and benefit the lives of others, and just to have a general sense of goodwill. I mean, I'm sure that I've known people like this. I consider you to be one of these kind of people, Dave, who go outside, who've gone well outside of what's been asked of you to reach around the world and try to better the lives of young Africans. We've all known people like this, and they are remarkable people. And then at the high end of the enlightenment spectrum, I use Ken Wilber's term, unity consciousness. And these are those few folks who really have gotten it from an enlightened perspective. And there's not a lot of those folks around. They tend to really impact the world in remarkable ways and even die at the hands of the people they're attempting to liberate in ways. We can think of Gandhi, who was killed, and M.L. King was the same way. And Jesus, of course, is a classic example. Yeah, I mean, there are just many, many examples of people who have transcended the ego to such an extent that they have, this more persistent union with that which transcends all things, which goes beyond words, I guess is how Joseph Campbell talked about it.
And I suppose that is the ultimate term of enlightenment.
Yes.
Unity consciousness of
Yes.
the great connectivity of all living things, I
yes,
suppose.
the realization of that. I really love, I can't give you the quote verbatim, but Albert Einstein had intimations of this and said that this is really our task as human beings, is to strive toward that end, to realize that we are all part of one great whole. And I don't mean that to sound like a Disney movie or New Age, mumbo jumbo. This is what the great mystics and sages of all time have been saying.
And it seems to me that those who have attained it, or at least have been close to it, are overwhelmingly non-denominational.
Yes, isn't that remarkable?
It is.
Yeah, they see truth in all cultures, in all walks of life, in all communities, and really serve to unite people in a way that is remarkable. And they are non-denominational. They are, I don't know if post-political is a word, but I think of that also. They're larger than tribe. I remember Gandhi being purported to say, I am a Muslim, I am a Jew, I am a Hindu, I am a Christian. And he might even say, I'm a non-believer today, given the numbers of increasing people who don't endorse any of those, but still are striving toward transcending the limiting confines of the ego through whatever means possible.
Very good. Thank you for taking the time, John, Dr. Rector.
Dave, thank you.
One last question, and I keep one question begs another question.
Okay.
Is your intended audience for this book? To whom are you writing?
God, that's a good question. I guess.
Is this a college level textbook? Do you hope to?
I wouldn't call this a text. I think that the publisher is calling it a trade book with scholarly crossover, right? So I do think that people who are interested in religion, people who are interested in philosophy, people who are interested in psychology, people who are interested in peace studies, people who are interested in women's studies.
People who are interested in personal growth.
People who are interested in, thank you, yeah. I wouldn't call it a self-help book, but it really is trying to make sense of the big questions, and I'm just putting my own little 2 cents in there. Of course, no one will ever make complete sense of such things, but the big questions of why is there evil, and why do we do it, and how can we take steps to gradually transcend this problem. Anyone interested in those topics, I think, hopefully would find the book to be meaningful.
Well, the name of the book, it comes out in July of 2014. The name of the book is The Objectification Spectrum, Understanding and Transcending Our Diminishment and Dehumanization of Others, Oxford University Press. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dave. Done.